September 1944. Supreme Allied Headquarters. The room was quiet, functional, stripped of drama. Maps lay flat on the table, their colored arrows already fading from overuse. Dwight D. Eisenhower stood at the center, flanked by senior American staff officers. Across from him sat Omar Bradley, commander of the U.S. 12th Army Group. No reporters were present. No speeches were made. This was not a public moment. It was an administrative one. The issue on the table was the advance toward Germany's western border. Bradley's forces were pressing east after the breakout from Normandy. One sector lay directly in their path, a dense, elevated forest along the German frontier. The name on the map was Hurtgen. Bradley had already committed units there. Losses were mounting. Progress was minimal. Alternatives existed. They were known. They were not discussed at length. Bradley stated his position without hesitation. The forest would be taken. The advance would continue through it, not around it. The justification was framed in operational language: control of terrain, protection of the flank, denial of access to river dams further east. The assessment assumed resistance could be worn down through persistence. The timeline was undefined. Eisenhower did not challenge the proposal. He did not demand revision. He did not call for an external review. The decision required no formal vote. It was accepted as presented. Authority remained where it was. Responsibility remained diffuse. What was decided in that room was not a battle plan in detail. It was something simpler and more consequential. The offensive into the Hürtgen Forest would continue under Bradley's command. No bypass would be authorized. No pause would be imposed. No commander would be relieved. The meeting ended without visible conflict. Orders moved down the chain. Infantry divisions moved forward. The forest remained where it was. The consequences were no longer a matter of planning. They were already in motion. In September 1944, the American armies in Western Europe possessed a level of operational freedom they would never regain. German resistance west of the Rhine was fractured, uneven, and critically short of reserves. Entire enemy formations were retreating faster than they could reorganize. Roads mattered more than ground. Rivers mattered more than villages. Momentum, not terrain, was the decisive factor. At that moment, the Hürtgen Forest was not a barrier to victory. It was a geographic anomaly. A dense, elevated woodland stretching along the German border, it offered no ports, no rail hubs, no industrial centers, and no decisive crossroads. It did not anchor the German front. It did not protect a field army. It sat adjacent to the American axis of advance without actually controlling it. From a purely military standpoint, the forest could be bypassed. The American army had done so repeatedly since the Normandy breakout. Strong points were isolated, masked, and reduced later or rendered irrelevant by deeper penetrations. This was the logic of mobile warfare, and it had already proven effective across France. German units left behind were forced either to withdraw or surrender once supply lines collapsed. The terrain inside the forest nullified nearly every American advantage. Armor could not maneuver. Artillery observation was restricted by canopy and elevation. Air power, the defining strength of the Western Allies, was largely blind. Movement was confined to narrow trails and logging roads that funneled infantry into predictable killing zones. Any force entering the forest would fight as light infantry, regardless of its actual composition. German defenders understood this perfectly. They did not need large numbers. They needed time and concealment. Field fortifications, mines, and pre-registered artillery fires multiplied their effectiveness. Even under pressure, they could trade space for casualties, knowing that replacement troops would enter the same terrain under the same disadvantages. The larger operational picture made the choice even clearer. South of the forest, open ground offered maneuver corridors toward the Rhine. To the north, Allied forces were already engaged along parallel axes. The German command lacked the reserves to respond effectively to a deep penetration. Any American thrust around the forest would force German units inside it to withdraw or risk encirclement. The forest would collapse as a position once it was strategically isolated. Control of the Roer River dams, often cited as the justification, did not require immediate frontal assault. The dams could be approached later from multiple directions or neutralized through operational depth once German forces east of the forest were pressured. Flooding the Roer was a temporary obstacle, not a war-winning maneuver. It delayed movement. It did not stop an army. Time was the critical variable. Every division committed to the forest was a division unavailable elsewhere. Every casualty sustained there reduced the combat power needed for exploitation beyond the German border. The opportunity in September 1944 was not to grind down resistance where it was strongest, but to accelerate collapse where it was weakest. This window did not depend on heroism or endurance. It depended on selection. The American army had the freedom to choose where to fight. It had the logistical capacity to support rapid movement. It had air superiority uncontested. What it lacked, in this instance, was restraint. The opportunity was real because the enemy was vulnerable, the alternatives were viable, and the cost-benefit balance was unmistakable. The forest offered no decisive gain. Going around it offered the possibility of ending organized resistance sooner, with fewer losses, and with greater strategic effect. That opportunity existed before the 1st Rifle Company crossed the tree line. Once the decision was made to enter, it narrowed with every step forward. By the time the first American units entered the Hürtgen Forest, the danger had already been identified inside the Allied command structure. It was not a mystery discovered afterward. It was recognized in advance, articulated clearly, and dismissed deliberately. The most direct assessment came from George S. Patton. Patton did not require additional intelligence or reconnaissance. He required only a map. The forest stood out immediately as terrain that punished the attacker and protected the defender. In Patton's view, it was not an objective. It was an obstacle that only became dangerous if treated as one. Patton's recommendation was operationally straightforward. Bypass the forest entirely. Advance around it on open ground. Cut supply routes to the German units inside. Let geography do the killing instead of American infantry. He did not argue that the forest was empty or irrelevant. He argued that it did not need to be taken to achieve the larger mission. German forces isolated in difficult terrain without mobility or resupply would collapse on their own timetable. This was not theoretical. It was consistent with how the American army had been fighting since the Normandy breakout. Patton's Third Army had repeatedly demonstrated that speed and depth produced results that attrition could not. Strong points were left behind, reduced later, or rendered meaningless by advances that severed command and logistics. This was not recklessness. It was an understanding of how a disintegrating enemy actually failed. Patton's warnings were not emotional or rhetorical. They were logistical. Infantry losses in restrictive terrain were irreversible in the short term. Replacements required time. Equipment could be replaced faster than trained soldiers. Forest fighting consumed manpower at a rate disproportionate to the ground gained. Patton had learned this lesson early in his career and reinforced it in Sicily and France. Other officers reached similar conclusions independently. Staff assessments noted that artillery effectiveness would be reduced, air support would be unreliable, and armor would be marginalized. German artillery firing from concealed positions would retain the initiative. Even success would be slow and expensive. Failure would be prolonged and cumulative. What distinguished Patton was not that he alone saw the problem, but that he was willing to state its implications clearly. He predicted that once the commitment was made, inertia would take over. Units already engaged would require reinforcement. Losses would demand relief units. The operation would continue not because it made sense, but because stopping would require admitting error. Patton also understood the institutional dynamics at work. Bradley commanded the sector. The offensive was his responsibility. To bypass the forest would implicitly concede that the original decision to enter it had been unnecessary. In a coalition war, admissions of error carried political weight beyond the battlefield. Patton knew this, and he knew it made his advice unwelcome. He recorded his concerns privately. He did not attempt to circumvent the chain of command. He did not seek public attention. He did not threaten resignation. His warnings were professional, restrained, and documented. He expected them to be weighed against the evidence and the alternatives. They were not. The forest remained defined as an objective rather than a liability. Momentum became a justification rather than a warning sign. Each additional casualty was framed as proof that the fight had to continue to justify what had already been spent. Patton's assessment did not change as the months passed. As casualty lists grew and divisions were rotated through the same ground, his original prediction held. The The forest consumed strength without producing strategic effect. The warnings had been accurate. The preparation had been sufficient. What followed was not a failure of foresight. It was the result of a decision to ignore it. The decision to continue the offensive through the Hürtgen Forest did not survive on military logic alone. It survived because reversing it carried institutional costs that senior command was unwilling to pay. At the center of that system stood Dwight D. Eisenhower. His authority was absolute in theory and conditional in practice. He commanded a coalition, not an army. Every major decision passed through political filters that had little to do with terrain or casualty projections. His primary task was not operational elegance. It was alliance stability. Bradley's position inside that structure mattered. As commander of the largest American army group in Europe, he was Eisenhower's principal domestic pillar. He was calm, reliable, publicly restrained, and politically safe. He did not challenge overarching strategy. He did not generate headlines. He did not embarrass superiors. In an alliance strained by egos and national sensitivities, these traits were valued as much as battlefield results. Reversing the Hürtgen decision would have required more than issuing new orders. It would have required acknowledging that the offensive should never have been launched as conceived. That admission would not remain confined to internal memoranda. It would ripple outward through command channels, congressional oversight, press scrutiny, and inter-allied comparison. It would invite questions about judgment at the highest American levels. Eisenhower had already spent months absorbing friction from British counterparts. Disputes over supply priority, operational focus, and command authority were constant. The memory of earlier controversies was still fresh. Any visible American self-correction that implied incompetence risked weakening Eisenhower's leverage in those negotiations. It also risked emboldening critics who argued that the American advance was being mishandled. Bradley understood this environment. He did not frame the Hürtgen offensive as an optional operation. He framed it as a necessity imposed by prudence. Flank security, river control, methodical advance. These terms reassured superiors that the situation was under control, even as casualty numbers rose. The language of caution disguised the reality of attrition. Institutional momentum did the rest. Once divisions were committed, withdrawal became psychologically and bureaucratically difficult. Units already engaged required relief. Relief units required justification. The longer the battle continued, the harder it became to stop without appearing to concede failure. Losses were reframed as sunk costs that demanded completion, not reconsideration. Eisenhower did not intervene because intervention would have created a precedent. If Bradley could be overridden for a costly but defensible operation, then every future decision would invite scrutiny. Eisenhower's command style relied on delegation and trust. To revoke that trust publicly would signal instability inside American leadership at a moment when unity was paramount. There was also a comparative element. Other commanders had committed forces to operations that failed visibly and quickly. Those failures created sharp political shocks. Hürtgen was different. It failed slowly. Casualties accumulated incrementally. There was no single catastrophic moment that forced immediate accountability. The absence of a dramatic collapse allowed leadership to normalize the losses. Behind closed doors, Eisenhower received reports detailing the conditions. He knew the terrain was unfavorable. He knew progress was measured in yards. He knew replacement flows were struggling to keep pace. None of this was hidden. What was absent was a trigger compelling him to act decisively against his own subordinate. Removing or publicly correcting Bradley would have meant confronting the uncomfortable reality that American command decisions, not just enemy resistance, were responsible for the outcome. It would also have destabilized the internal balance Eisenhower relied upon to manage more volatile personalities elsewhere in the command structure. So the system closed ranks. Orders were adjusted at the margins. Objectives were rephrased. Timelines were extended. No inquiry was launched. No relief was ordered. The forest became a place where losses were endured rather than explained. This was not conspiracy. It was risk management. Eisenhower chose continuity over correction. He accepted attrition as the price of avoiding political fracture. Bradley remained in command not because the operation succeeded, but because removing him would have forced the system to confront its own error. The overrule never came because it was never formally proposed. Military logic did not lose an argument. It was never allowed to make one. The consequences of the decision were not immediate, and that delay made them easier to ignore. The Hürtgen Forest did not produce a dramatic collapse or a single day of disaster. It produced erosion. Division by division, company by company, combat power was consumed in an environment that offered no opportunity to regain it. American infantry entered the forest expecting rotation and relief. Instead, they encountered repetition. Units were pulled out shattered, reconstituted with replacements, and sent back into the same ground. Terrain did not change. German defensive methods did not change. Casualty patterns did not change. The only variable was the steady depletion of experienced soldiers. By November 1944, the forest had absorbed multiple American divisions. Some ceased to exist as coherent fighting formations. Others survived in name only, their ranks filled with men who had never trained together and officers who had inherited commands under fire. The ground gained measured in miles did not justify the manpower expended to take it. The physical effects were cumulative. Cold weather set in early. Mud replaced dust. Evacuation times increased as trails collapsed under traffic. Wounded men waited longer. Frostbite became a factor alongside shrapnel and bullets. Artillery fire continued to detonate in treetops, turning the forest canopy into a weapon that never exhausted its ammunition. The psychological damage was harder to quantify, but no less real. Veterans described a loss of confidence not in their own courage, but in the purpose of their orders. They fought because they were told to fight, not because the objective made sense. That distinction mattered. It shaped how units recovered, how replacements integrated, and how officers assessed risk. The German defenders did not win the forest in any conventional sense. They did not destroy the American armies there. They delayed them. That delay was enough. Every week spent in the forest was a week not spent exploiting German weakness elsewhere. The broader front slowed as resources were fed into a fight that could not end decisively. By early December, the American army in the sector was exhausted. Reserves existed on paper, but their quality had declined. Units pulled from Hurtgen were assigned to quiet sectors to recover. One of those sectors lay to the west, in the Ardennes. It was considered unsuitable for major offensive action. That assumption was shared by both sides. When the German counteroffensive began in mid-December, it struck forces that were present but hollow. Some of the divisions holding the line had been bled white weeks earlier in the forest. They lacked depth, cohesion, and confidence. Their defensive positions were thin because the army no longer had the manpower to make them dense. The initial breakthroughs reflected this imbalance. German forces did not encounter a fresh, layered defense. They encountered units still rebuilding, still integrating replacements, still recovering from attrition that had achieved nothing strategic. The result was rapid penetration and widespread confusion in the opening days. The response required emergency measures. Units were rushed in from other sectors. Plans were improvised. Supply priorities shifted overnight. The burden of restoring the situation fell on commanders and formations that had not been ground down in the forest. The price of that recovery was paid elsewhere, under worse conditions, against an enemy fighting for survival. The irony was unavoidable. The forest that had been attacked to protect the advance ended up weakening the army at the moment protection was most needed. The men who had been spent there were unavailable when the crisis came. The time consumed there could not be reclaimed when speed mattered most. When the German offensive was finally contained and reversed, the narrative shifted quickly. Attention moved to the scale of the enemy gamble and the resilience of the Allied response. The earlier months receded into context rather than cause. Hurtgen became background, not explanation. But the linkage was direct. The army that faced the German attack was not the army that had broken out of Normandy. It was smaller in effect, if not in numbers. It had less margin for error. That condition was not imposed by enemy brilliance alone. It was shaped by prior choices. The consequences extended beyond immediate operations. Replacement pipelines were strained. Training standards were compressed. Officers promoted to fill losses lacked preparation. These effects persisted into the final months of the war, influencing how aggressively the army could exploit later opportunities. None of this required hindsight to predict. The warnings had been explicit. The attritional nature of the terrain was understood. The limited strategic value was known. What changed was not the analysis, but the willingness to accept its implications. By the time the forest was finally cleared, its relevance had evaporated. The front had moved on. The dams were no longer decisive. The German army was collapsing under pressure elsewhere. The ground taken did not alter the outcome of the war. What remained was the ledger. Tens of thousands of casualties incurred in an operation that neither accelerated victory nor prevented later disaster. The forest did not decide the war. It shaped the cost at which the war was finished. Those costs were not borne evenly. They fell on infantry units committed repeatedly to the same ground, and on families who received notifications that explained nothing beyond duty and sacrifice. The system absorbed the losses and continued forward, as designed. The decision made months earlier had played itself out, not in a single moment of failure, but in a long sequence of consequences that could no longer be separated from their origin. After the war, the record settled into place quietly. There was no formal reckoning for the Hürtgen Forest. No commission was convened. No senior officer was called to account in public testimony. The campaign faded into the mass of operations that could be summarized without scrutiny. Omar Bradley emerged from the war with his reputation intact. He was promoted, decorated, and later elevated to the highest rank in the United States Army. In his post-war writings, the Hürtgen Forest appeared as a difficult but necessary fight, shaped by terrain and weather rather than command choice. Casualties were acknowledged but not dissected. Responsibility was diffused into circumstance. Bradley's memoirs emphasized caution, steadiness, and the burdens of coalition warfare. Decisions were framed as prudent responses to uncertainty. The forest was described as an obstacle imposed by geography, not as an objective selected by command. Alternatives were not explored in detail. The option of bypass was largely absent. Dwight D. Eisenhower followed a similar pattern. His accounts focused on alliance management and strategic balance. Hurtgen was treated as one of many grinding engagements on the road to victory. The cumulative losses were acknowledged only as part of a larger arithmetic of war. The decision-making chain remained intact, unexamined. This was not accidental. Eisenhower's post-war standing depended on the perception of unified, competent leadership. To single out Hurtgen as a failure of judgment would have invited broader questions about delegation and oversight. It would have weakened the narrative of controlled progress that underpinned both his military legacy and his later political career. By contrast, operations that failed quickly and visibly attracted far more attention. They produced identifiable moments of collapse. Hurtgen did not. Its violence was spread over months. Its casualties arrived in increments. There was no single date that demanded explanation. The absence of a clear endpoint made retrospective accountability easier to avoid. Declassified documents released decades later did not significantly alter the picture. Staff reports confirmed what participants already knew, that terrain negated advantages, that progress was slow, and that losses were high. What they did not contain was evidence of serious consideration given to abandoning the effort once it was underway. The inertia was institutional, not personal. Veterans' accounts filled some of the gap. Their descriptions emphasized futility rather than heroism. The forest was remembered not as a proving ground, but as a place where orders continued without purpose. These testimonies accumulated outside official histories, shaping memory without altering record. In professional military studies, Hurtgen often appeared as a cautionary example of terrain and attrition. It was discussed abstractly, stripped of names and decisions. The lesson became environmental rather than human. By removing agency, the analysis preserved reputations. The promotion and protection of Bradley contrasted sharply with the treatment of more outspoken commanders. Public controversy, not battlefield outcome, proved more dangerous to careers. This pattern was visible during the war and confirmed afterward. Compliance mattered more than results, provided failure did not rupture the alliance. By the time historians revisited the campaign in depth, the principal actors were gone. The institutional incentives to revisit responsibility had vanished with them. What remained was consensus language that described Hurtgen as tragic, costly, and unavoidable. It was none of those things. The record, taken as a whole, shows that the losses were known, the alternatives were understood, and the continuation was chosen. The absence of accountability was not the result of missing information. It was the product of a system that valued stability over correction. In the post-war record, the Hürtgen Forest exists as a footnote rather than a verdict. The men who made the decision advanced. The men who paid for it did not. The file was closed without being read. The Hürtgen Forest is now a settled matter. The outcome is known. The records are complete. No further evidence will change what happened. A decision was made in a command room to continue an offensive that offered no decisive value. That decision was sustained not by necessity, but by institutional convenience. Military logic identified alternatives. Those alternatives were rejected because accepting them would have required admitting error. The cost was measurable. Approximately 33,000 American casualties were incurred in terrain that did not alter the course of the war. The losses weakened the force at a moment when strength was needed elsewhere. They did not secure a breakthrough. They did not prevent a later crisis. They did not shorten the conflict. The system rewarded compliance. The commander who executed the decision remained protected. Advancement followed. The responsibility dissolved upward into collective language and downward into anonymous sacrifice. No corrective action was taken because correction threatened stability. This was not a failure of courage at the front. The infantry fought as ordered. It was not a failure of intelligence. The warnings were clear. It was a failure of command culture. Reputation management outweighed operational adjustment. Political cohesion took precedence over force preservation. The contrast is instructive without being stated. Words spoken at a podium nearly ended careers. Decisions written on maps did not. The system punished embarrassment more readily than it punished waste. History recorded the victory and moved on. The forest was reclassified as inevitable. The casualties were folded into totals. The choice that caused them was buried under outcomes elsewhere. This case is closed because the mechanism is visible. Authority deferred to convenience. Accountability yielded to alliance management. The cost was paid by those without access to the room where the decision was made. Nothing further is required to understand it. If you want more examinations of decisions like this, documented without ceremony and closed without sentiment, leave a comment and subscribe to the channel.